I'm 72 years old, and before my heart finally gives up, I need to tell what nobody would believe even if I screamed it from the top of every mountain in Oregon. In 1967, when I was only 24 years old and wore the green forest ranger uniform like it was armor against the unknown, I met something that would forever change my understanding of who should really be afraid of whom in this world. I've kept this secret for 55 years. I lost my wife because she knew I was hiding something. I lost promotions because I refused to leave my post in the mountains. I lost friends, family, the chance to have children who would grow up respecting me. All because, on a cold October night, in the darkest reaches of the Cascade Range, a creature nearly 3 meters tall held my hand with a gentleness no man had ever shown, looked deep into my eyes with an ancestral sadness, and told me something about humanity that haunts me to this day. Not with words. Bigfoot doesn't speak like us, but what he showed me, what he made me feel that night and in the hundreds of nights that followed, was clearer than any speech. We, humans, are the true monsters of this forest. I was young, arrogant, full of that masculine stupidity that confuses courage with ignorance. My father had been a lumberjack, my grandfather too, and I grew up believing the forest existed to serve man. When I got the ranger job at the monitoring station near Mount Jefferson, I thought it would just be another bureaucratic job, checking trails, fining fishermen without licenses, putting out poorly extinguished campfires. The loneliness didn't scare me. I had my rifle, my cabin, my radio. I thought I controlled that piece of green and humid world that stretched for endless miles. How wrong I was. How wrong we all are. The first time I felt I was being watched was on a September afternoon when autumn was beginning to paint the trees gold and red. I was walking the North Trail, the one few tourists use because it was steep and treacherous, checking illegal traps that hunters left for deer. The silence was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, no wind. Just that heavy silence that seems to press your ears from the inside out. And then I felt it. I didn't see, I didn't hear, I felt. Something enormous was watching me through the curtain of pine trees. My whole body shivered. My hand flew to the gun in the holster. I spun quickly, swept the forest with my eyes, looking for bears, cougars, anything that made sense. Nothing. Just shadows and the smell of wet moss. But I knew something was there. For weeks, that feeling haunted me. Every time I left the cabin, every time I checked the trails, every time I cut firewood in the yard, I felt the eyes, immense, ancient, patient. I started leaving things, food scraps at the edge of the forest, old bread, fruit. I told myself it was for the raccoons, but deep down I knew. I was feeding something that shouldn't exist, something that mountain men whispered about in stinking bars between sips of cheap whiskey and nervous laughter. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the forest giant. I laughed at these stories when I was a child. Now, at 24, standing on my cabin porch with a trembling rifle in my hands, I prayed they were real, because the alternative, that I was going crazy alone in those mountains, was worse. It was on a new moon night when the darkness was so complete I could barely see my own hand in front of my face that he finally revealed himself. I was outside, smoking my last cigarette before bed, when I heard the branch break. It wasn't a small sound. It was the kind of sound a young tree makes when something heavy, very heavy, steps on it. My blood froze. I threw down the cigarette. I grabbed the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and there he was. The creature was almost 3 meters tall, maybe more, and was standing less than 10 meters from me, at the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood. The flashlight beam captured first the eyes, deep, dark, too intelligent to be in animals. Then the body, covered in long, matted hair, a grayish brown that seemed to merge with the night itself. The shoulders were as wide as a door, the arms hanging almost to the knees, huge hands with fingers that moved nervously. But what paralyzed me wasn't the size, it was the posture. He wasn't threatening, he was curious and scared. Scared of me. My hand was trembling so much that the light danced wildly, creating grotesque shadows on the surrounding pine trees. I should have screamed, should have run, should have grabbed the rifle leaning against the cabin wall just 2 meters away. But I did none of that, because in that moment, looking at that impossible creature that everyone said didn't exist, I saw something that completely disarmed me. Vulnerability. He took a step back when the light hit his face full on. He raised a huge hand, almost human, protecting his eyes, and he made a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, guttural moan, almost sad. "I won't hurt you," I whispered, without even thinking. My voice came out choked, ridiculous, as if that thing could understand me. As if my words meant anything to a creature that had probably witnessed centuries of forest before I was even born. But he reacted. The hand lowered slowly. The eyes met mine again. And for an infinite moment, we just stared at each other. The man and the myth, separated by 10 meters of cold earth and decades of stories no one believed. He was the one who moved first. He crouched down slowly, very slowly, until he was squatting. Even then he was immense. Even then the muscles stood out under the fur wet with dew. He extended a hand in my direction. Not aggressively, not threateningly. It was an almost gentle gesture. As if he was asking my permission. Permission for what? To approach? To trust? I didn't know. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. "It's okay," I said, lowering the flashlight so as not to blind him. "You can come." He approached with careful movements, almost cat-like, each step calculated not to scare me. The distance between us decreased. 8 meters. 6. 4. The smell arrived before him. Wet earth. Old moss, something wild but not unpleasant, something that belonged to that forest in a way I would never belong. When he finally stopped, he was so close I could touch him if I extended my arm. My breath came out in clouds of steam in the freezing October air. So did his. Then he did something I would never forget. He took my hand. It wasn't abrupt, it wasn't violent. Those enormous fingers, each the size of a thick sausage, wrapped around my right hand with a delicacy that made me want to cry. The skin was rough, calloused, covered with hair that tickled my palm. But it was warm, so alive. He held my hand and gently pulled me closer. I let him. God help me, I let that impossible creature pull me into the darkness, away from the cabin, away from the light, away from everything I knew as safe. We walked in silence through the forest, he in front, me behind, still holding hands like a child being guided by a father. My flashlight illuminated only small circles of the ground, twisted roots, moss-covered stones, dead leaves forming soft carpets. The sound of our footsteps was all that existed in the world. His, heavy and deliberate, mine, trembling and small. After about 20 minutes, we arrived at a small clearing I had never seen before, even though I had patrolled those trails for months. He let go of me. He pointed to a fallen log. I sat without questioning. He sat in front of me, so close our knees almost touched. And then, under the dim light of my flashlight left on the ground between us, he began to show me things. Not with words, with gestures, with sounds, with those infinitely sad eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 burned forests, 1,000 dead brothers, 1,000 generations fleeing from man. He pointed to himself. He beat his chest. He made a sound, oom, deep, resonant. Then he pointed to the surrounding forest, making wide movements with his arms. Then he pointed to me and made a gesture that froze my blood. He ran his hand across his neck as if cutting. Then he pointed again to the forest, again to me, again the cutting gesture. He was telling me that humans killed, that humans destroyed, that we were the danger. And in that moment, sitting in a secret clearing with a creature that shouldn't exist, I understood. I understood everything. In the months that followed that first night, my life split into two worlds. The world of daytime lies, where I was just a forest ranger fulfilling his routine tasks, and the world of nighttime truth, where I met with a being that science said was impossible. Every night, when the sun set behind the mountains and the forest filled with that humid and living darkness, he appeared. Sometimes at the edge of the clearing, sometimes farther away, calling me with that deep sound I had learned to recognize even through the wind. And I went. I always went. I grabbed my flashlight, my heavier jacket, and plunged into the darkness to meet my impossible friend. I began to call him Samuel. I don't know why. The name just came one night when he showed me a horrible scar on his left shoulder, an old wound, white and irregular, that could only have been made by a bullet. "Samuel," I said, gently touching the mark. He didn't react to the name, but his eyes closed when my fingers traced the mark of human cruelty. Since then, he was Samuel, my secret, my burden, my only real connection to something greater than the petty smallness of human life. The communication between us evolved slowly, like a dance neither of us knew exactly how to lead. I brought food, fruits, breads, sometimes dried meat. He always accepted, but I noticed he preferred fruits. Apples were his favorites. He held them in both hands, huge and delicate, and bit slowly, savoring.
Sometimes he brought things for me. Beautiful stones from the river, eagle feathers. Once a small fox skull that was perfectly clean and white. I kept everything in a box under my bed. My secret collection of gifts from a ghost. But what he most wanted to show me were the wounds. Not just his, but the forest's. On a freezing November night, Samuel took me to an area I had never patrolled, very far north, almost at the park boundary. There, under the light of my flashlight, I saw the destruction. Illegally cut, century-old trees, the stumps still bleeding sap. Cruel traps buried in the ground, some still with fur and blood. Human garbage scattered, beer cans, food wrappers, even an old mattress thrown in a crystal-clear stream. Samuel pointed to all of this, then to himself, then made that throat-cutting gesture that had become our language for death and danger. I understood. He was showing me what remained when humans passed through. He was showing me why his species hid, why they were afraid, why even being stronger, larger, more adapted to that forest, they were the ones fleeing from us. Because we didn't just kill, we destroyed. We didn't just need to survive, we needed to dominate, control, possess. And what we couldn't possess, we annihilated. There was one night, I think it was December because there was thin snow covering everything, when Samuel showed me something that broke me. We were in our usual clearing, and he had brought something wrapped in large leaves. When he opened the bundle, I saw bones, small, delicate, child bones, not human, from his species. He placed the bones on the ground between us with a reverence that made me understand it was his child, or brother, or nephew. Someone he loved. Someone humans had killed. He didn't cry. I don't know if they can cry. But the pain in his eyes was so deep, so absolute, that I cried for him. Hot tears streaming down my frozen face as he showed me bone by bone what remained of someone he would never see again. When he finished, he carefully gathered everything, wrapped it again, and buried it right there, digging with those powerful hands until he made a deep hole in the frozen earth. I helped him. We used our bare hands, both bleeding on our fingers because of the stones and roots, but neither of us stopped until we finished. After that, something changed between us. We were no longer just observers of each other. We were accomplices. I began to intentionally sabotage certain hunting operations in the region. I forgot to report trails leading to territories where I knew Samuel and possibly others of his species moved. I misinformed hunters about sightings. Once, I found a group of 3 men with tracking equipment obviously aimed at something bigger than deer. I told them grizzly bears had been spotted in the opposite direction. They believed me. Samuel was safe for another night. But my dedication had a price. My supervisor began asking questions. Why did I never bring reports about the northern region? Why did I prefer night shifts? Why had I refused to transfer to a station closer to civilization with better pay? I invented weak excuses about loving solitude, about working on a personal wildlife cataloging project. He didn't believe me, but he also had no proof of anything, just suspicions. Suspicions that would follow me for the rest of my career. And then, on a January night in 1968, when the snow covered everything with almost a meter of height, and the cold was so intense that my breath froze on my lips, Samuel brought me another gift. It wasn't a stone or a bone. It was another one of them, a female. Smaller than him, but still immense by my human standards. She was injured, a hurt leg, probably from a trap. Samuel looked at me with that silent expectation I had learned to read. He wanted my help. It was the first time I used my first aid kit to treat something that wasn't human or a domestic animal. I worked for hours on that leg while she moaned softly and Samuel held her hand. I cleaned the wound with antiseptic. I removed the pieces of metal from the trap that was still stuck in the flesh. I bandaged everything with white gauze that quickly became stained with dark blood. She let me do all of this. She trusted me. And when I finished, she touched my face with a gentle hand, leaving that forest smell on my skin. That night, walking back to the cabin as dawn began to lighten the sky, I knew there was no turning back. I had crossed the line. I was no longer a human observing mysterious creatures. I was a traitor to my own species. And strangely, I felt more human than ever. The spring of 1968 brought more than flowers and birds back to the Oregon forests. It brought men, many men. There were rumors, whispers traveling from bar to bar in the small towns around the park about enormous footprints found in the melted snow, about strange howls heard by lumberjacks, about a giant creature seen by a camping couple who had fled, leaving all their equipment behind.
The local press had started publishing sensationalist articles, and worse, there was a group of self-proclaimed cryptozoologists coming from Seattle, equipped with cameras, traps, and the typical arrogance of those who think they can capture the impossible. I was terrified, not for me, but for Samuel, for that female I had treated, for any others of his species inhabiting those mountains, because I knew what humans did when they found something they didn't understand. We killed, we dissected, we put in cages, we turned into spectacle. History was full of examples: indigenous peoples displayed in human zoos, rare animals tortured in circuses, every scientific discovery stained with blood and suffering. Samuel knew it too. I could see it in the way he moved now. More cautious, more scared, constantly looking over his shoulder. Our meetings became rarer and briefer. He would appear, check if I was okay, show me where his family had moved, always farther, always higher in the mountains, and disappear before I could even offer food. The urgency in his eyes was clear. They were fleeing, again, as always, as they had done for centuries. It was in April that everything almost fell apart. I was doing a forced daytime patrol. My supervisor had insisted I couldn't only do night shifts, when I heard the gunshots. They weren't normal hunting shots. There were many, automatic, coming from the northeast region, exactly where I knew Samuel and his family had established a new meeting point. My blood froze. I dropped everything and ran. It took me 40 minutes to get there, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally found the source of the shots, I saw a group of 5 men, hunters by their rifles and camouflage clothes, surrounding a thick tree. They were shooting upward, laughing, shouting profanities. And there, in the highest branches, I saw a young one, a youth of Samuel's species, no bigger than a human teenager, huddled and trembling, covered in blood. "Stop!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. "Lower your weapons now! You're on federal property!" They turned, surprised. One of them, a fat man with a red beard, spat on the ground. "It's just a damn bear, Ranger. Relax." "That's not a bear," I said, keeping my gun pointed. "And you're going to lower your weapons, or I'll arrest you for illegal hunting in a protected area." There was a tense moment where I thought there had to be more shots. But finally, one by one, they lowered their weapons. They grumbled, they threatened lawsuits. They said they'd come back with lawyers. But they left. I waited until I couldn't hear their voices anymore before running to the tree. The young one had come down and was lying at the base of the trunk. He had 3 wounds, one in the shoulder, one in the thigh, one grazing the ribs. None fatal, but all bleeding abundantly. I knelt beside him, my hands already opening my first aid kit. "It's okay," I whispered, knowing he probably didn't understand. "I'm going to take care of you." That's when Samuel appeared. He emerged from the tree so silently that I didn't hear him until he was there, huge and threatening, positioning himself between me and the wounded youth. His eyes were wild with fear and anger. For the first time since I'd known him, I felt afraid of him, real fear, because he no longer saw me as a friend. He saw just another human, another monster. "Samuel," I said quietly, raising my blood-stained hands, "it's me. Let me help, please." It took long seconds for recognition to return to his eyes. When it did, the anger disappeared, replaced by that deep sadness I knew so well. He stepped aside. He let me care for the young one. His son, I realized later, by the way he watched my every move with that universal parental concern that transcends species. I worked fast. I stopped the bleeding. I cleaned the wounds. I used all the gauze and band-aids I had. When I finished, Samuel picked up the young one in his arms as if he weighed nothing and disappeared into the forest. There was no thank you. There was no goodbye. Just that last look. A look that said, "I trusted you, and you people almost killed my son." That night, back in my cabin, I wrote my resignation letter. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't pretend I was protecting the forest when in reality I was presiding over its destruction. When my supervisor received the letter, he didn't seem surprised, just tired. "You saw something out there, didn't you? Something you shouldn't have." I didn't answer. I packed my things, turned in my uniform, and left. But I didn't go far. I bought a small piece of land at the edge of the park, all I could afford with my miserable savings, and built a house smaller than my old ranger cabin. I got a job as a carpenter in the nearest town. My life became small, quiet, dedicated to a single thing: keeping watch. Every night I walked the forest border. I left food. I left signs. I waited. Samuel never came back. But sometimes, on moonless nights, when the wind blew right, I heard that deep sound. Ooh, distant, sad, alive. And I knew he was still there, still fleeing, still hiding his family, still teaching his children that the forest's greatest predator didn't have claws or fangs. It had guns and an infinite capacity for cruelty. I lived 48 years in that small house on the forest border. I watched the region change. Villages became cities, trails became roads. The forest shrank year after year, eaten by development and human greed. I married once, briefly, to a kind woman who never understood why I spent every night walking alone in the dark. She left me after 3 years, without anger, just sadness. "You're always waiting for someone," she said in farewell, "and that someone isn't me." She was right. I was waiting, always waiting. Samuel never appeared again, but I kept leaving food. I kept keeping watch. I anonymously reported illegal hunters. I sabotaged 3 attempts at cryptozoological expeditions by spreading false rumors about sightings in completely opposite locations. I bought land adjacent to the park whenever I could, creating small unofficial protection zones. My life became a silent tribute to a friendship the world thought was fiction. The years passed. My hair turned white. My back became curved. Arthritis took over my fingers, those same fingers that had once treated wounds of a species that shouldn't exist. I kept waiting. It was on a September morning last year, 2022, 55 years after that first encounter, that I found the sign. I woke up to go to the bathroom before dawn and saw through the window footprints, enormous, fresh, leading to my front door and then back to the forest. And on my porch step, carefully placed, was an object that made me fall to my knees and cry like a child. It was a stone, smooth, white, exactly like those Samuel used to bring me decades ago. But it wasn't just a stone. When I picked it up with my trembling hands, I saw it had something carved, scratched really, with some primitive tool. They were 2 figures, one large, one small, holding hands. He had come back. After all these years, after everything, he had come back. I didn't wait for the sun to rise. I put on my warmest coat, the same coat I wore on those nights in 1967, now patched and faded, and went. I followed the footprints into the forest, my old body protesting with every step, but my soul lighter than it had been in decades. The footprints led me to the clearing, our clearing, the place where he had shown me the bones of his lost child, the place where everything had changed. And there he was. Samuel was sitting on the same fallen log, waiting. But he was no longer the powerful youth I had known. He was old now, as old as me. His fur was almost completely white, his back curved, his hands trembled slightly. But those eyes, those deep and sad eyes, were the same. I sat in front of him. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just stayed there, 2 old friends reunited after a lifetime, as the sun rose through the trees and painted everything golden. After a long time, Samuel stood up. He walked to the area where we had buried those small bones so long ago. He knelt there, placed a hand on the earth. Then he looked at me and made a sound, that deep, Ooh, that I hadn't heard in decades. But this time it was different, softer, sadder. It was a farewell. I know, I said, my voice breaking. I know. He approached one last time. He took my hand, that old and wrinkled hand in his, which were equally old and wrinkled now. He held tight, and he tasted my hand over his heart. I felt the beats, strong, slow, alive. He placed my other hand over my own heart, and with that simple gesture, he told me everything he needed to say. We're not so different, he and I, his species and mine. We all have hearts that beat. We all feel fear, love, loss. The difference is that his species learned to live in harmony with the world, and mine never learned, never wanted to learn. We prefer to dominate, destroy, conquer, and because of that, species like his disappear into the shadows, forced to choose between quick extinction by our guns or slow extinction by the destruction of their habitat. That was the truth he had tried to teach me that first night, 55 years ago. That was the message I failed to transmit to the world because I knew no one would believe it. We, humans, like to see ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, as superior, as worthy of inheriting the earth. But a species that needs to destroy everything around it to feel safe isn't superior. It's just scared, and scared things are dangerous. Samuel released my hands. He stepped back slowly. He took one last look, those eyes meeting mine for a final time, and then he turned and began walking into the forest. I watched him go. I didn't try to follow him. I didn't shout for him to stay. I just observed as his huge, arched silhouette disappeared among the trees, becoming shadow, becoming myth, becoming one more story no one would believe. When I could no longer see him, I took the carved stone from my pocket, the two figures holding hands, and I understood the final gift. It wasn't just a memory, it was a record, proof that for a brief moment in history, a human and a Sasquatch had met not as predator and prey, not as scientist and specimen, but as friends, as equals. I'm 72 years old now. My heart is weak. The doctors say it could be any moment. I'm writing this as my final testament, my confession, my plea for forgiveness on behalf of my entire species. Samuel showed me the true monstrosity isn't in the beings hiding in the forest shadows. It's in those who build cities over cemeteries of ancient trees and then wonder why the world is dying. If you're reading this, know this. They exist. They're real. They're intelligent, emotional, capable of love and sadness. And they're afraid of us. Afraid of what we've done to their world. Afraid of what we'll still do. And they're right. God forgive me, they're completely right. I left instructions for this story to be published after my death. I left the carved stone for the nearest natural history museum. I left my land in permanent conservation trust. It won't save Samuel's species. Probably nothing will. But maybe, just maybe, it will make one person rethink before shooting something they don't understand. Before destroying something they can't rebuild, before turning into a trophy something that should be left in peace. Samuel was right about us from the beginning. We are the true monsters of this story. And I carried that terrible knowledge alone for the rest of my life.